أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هو الذي جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا فامشوا في مناكبها وكلوا من رزقه وإليه النشور أأمنتم من في السماء أن يخسف بكم الأرض فإذا هي تمور أم أمنتم من في السماء أن يرسل عليكم حاسبا فستعلمون كيف نذير ولقد كذب الذين من قبلهم فكيف كان نكير صدق الله العلي العظيم. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Surah Al-Mulk, verses 15 to 18. He it is who made the earth smooth for you. Therefore go about in the spacious sides thereof, and eat of his sustenance, and to him is a return after death. Are you secure of those in the heaven that he should not make the earth to swallow you up? Then look, it shall be in the state of commotion. Or are you secure of those in the heaven that he should not send down upon you a punishment? Then shall you know how was my warning. And certainly those before them rejected the truth. Then how was my disapproval? Salawat.
Today we will continue the series by Shaykh Ali Reza Khaki on the ethics of crying. So can we welcome him with a loud salawat? Shaykh Ali Reza Khaki has been studying Islamic studies the past few years and is involved in inter and intra-faith work and community cohesion. He graduated from the Mahdi Institute. He completed his postgraduate studies in Islamic studies and currently teaches Islamic studies modules at the Institute. Salawat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we've looked in the past few nights at the certain morning rituals, and we looked at the development of these morning rituals historically, and also we looked particularly at Ziyarah yesterday and the notion of cursing and what it should really what ziyarat and dua and everything for that matter should really evoke within ourselves. A consistent feature that is throughout these talks is that there needs to be congruence within ourselves. We need to know why we're doing what we're doing, and we need to be genuine in doing what we're doing. The Qur'an mentions وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ اتَّبِعُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ قَالُوا بَلْ نَتَّبِعُ مَا أَلْفَيْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا. When they are told, follow what Allah has sent down, they say, no, we will follow what we have found our fathers doing, our fathers following. And this is the principle. Why are we doing what we're doing? Are we doing things because everybody else is doing it? Are we doing things because our fathers have been doing it? And that isn't an acceptable principle according to the Qur'an. The Qur'an, and if you look at the life of the prophets and the saints, they always challenge this notion that we must know why we're doing what we're doing, even if what we're doing is right. There must be a reasoning behind it. We can't just do something because everybody else is doing it. We will be raised on the day of judgment, and you'll be asked, who is your Lord? Not the Lord of your fathers or the Lord of the community. It's each and every one of our individual journeys that we need to know what we're doing. And it's an individual journey. Today what I'll be looking at is the Maqtal literature, the historical events, and the development of, I'll look at a case study of the development of this literature. Now Maqtal literature, as you know, are the literature talking about the death of Imam Hussein. Now, as we'll see later on, in the 20th century, scholars realize that this movement, this remembrance of Hussein, is very powerful. And they also recognized that there's lots of falsities being propagated in the name of these stories, in the name of the tragedy of Imam Hussein. Lots of exaggeration. Till today, if you look at certain communities, there's still a lot of exaggeration regarding the story of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Now, Shahid Mutahari writes this article on this, which is translated into English, where he criticizes and critiques these stories that have been reciting. And he says that two duties. One is the duty of the speaker to research and to verify, or to even mention, qualify what they say. The second is the duty of the listener. Now, many a time the format of lectures is such that it's the speaker speaking and the listener does passively just listens. But that isn't the way it ought to be. That, if something doesn't make sense, that person should think for themselves. The Quran mentions أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ أَفَلَا تَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Do you not think? Do you not use your intellect? For much of our community, we suspend our intellect. We don't think. And it's really important for us to think. It's really important for us to reflect. It's really important for us to be cognizant of why we're doing what we're doing. Now, coming back to this topic, history. So what I want to differentiate between history and narrative. So history is what happened. Imam Hussein got killed. Yeah, we know that. That's a fact from history, from different sources. Narrative is that mode of representation of history. Now, it may be in the form of a mythology. I'm not talking about this particular instance, but generally speaking, narrative can be in the form of mythology, like myths. And this could be because of that culture at that time. It could be fiction, something imaginative. Or it could be something that is factual, history-based. Now, coming to the story of Imam Hussein, so we have the story of Imam Hussein. We know, to some extent, with surety, what happened. But everything else is up for grabs. There's a lot of narrative. There's how do you know this happened with such detail, that Imam Hussein did such things with such detail? And we ask ourselves this. Now, there's an element of poetic license, right? If you hear certain Matams, you hear certain recitations, poems, there's an element of poetic license, which is fine, right? But we need to be cognizant of that and recognize that there is this differentiation. Now, what happens many a time in many centers is based on supply and demand. The demand is to make us cry. Now, if you come and somebody comes and just mentions historical facts, Ayatollah Mutahari mentions in his discussion, he says that there was a person who had this majlis, and they called a reciter. Now, the person who called the reciter said that, listen, stick to the facts, no exaggeration. So the guy said, are you sure? I said, yeah. I'm using poetic license to add a few words here and there. But he said, yeah, let's just stick to the facts. So the guy started reciting. Nobody's crying. So they started talking. He said, this host of ours, there's no barakah in his gathering. Nobody is crying. So he points to the reciter and says, go on, exaggerate a bit, make it spicy a bit. And this Ayatollah Mutahari mentions this. So there is this element of supply and demand. And we find this in our communities, where there is this want for people to cry. We ask ourselves the question, what is the purpose of crying? Is it supposed to bring about something more? Is it supposed to evoke something within us? Or is it just merely crying? We're just crying for Abu Abdullah. Is that it? That's it, chapter closed. Something to think about, and we have this, Paul, what factors do you think speakers are invited for in narrating the tragedy of Karbala. So you can join slido.com with the code of mourning. Is it to present the facts, to stimulate emotions, or you're not sure? And from your experience, there's no right or wrong answer. So growing up, listening to the story of Imam Hussein, I could, the majalis were recited, for example, in Urdu, a language that I didn't resonate with at the time. And the reciters were from the subcontinent, and they would shout and scream from the mimbars. Something me personally, this is my own journey, you may have your own journeys, I couldn't resonate with that. So there is this element of wanting to stimulate emotion without verifying, and we saw yesterday, one of the reasons, one of the doors that opens this is the principle of leniency. When it comes to history and historical facts, there is a sort of leniency. We don't need to investigate thoroughly. We will just take it at face value. What I want to look at is a case study of Ali Asghar. And I will go through these different sources. This is discussed in detail in the Shia Scholars Forum. I'll just summarize this. How the story of Ali Asghar develops over time. So let us look at this. So we have one of the earliest sources, Ibn Sa'd in his At-Tabaqat al-Kabir, mentions, Ibn Sa'd passes away 230. وَعَبْدُ قُتِلَ مَعَ أَبِيهِ. Abdullah was killed with his father. It's one-liner. Then we go on. Mus'ab bin Zubair mentions the mother as Rubab, which wasn't mentioned initially. Al-Baladhuri now mentions how this child was killed. He was killed by an arrow. And by who? By Harmala. Al-Yaqubi continues, 284, passes away. He gives more details. It was a newborn baby. The Imam was on a horse. The arrow struck the neck. The Imam extracted the arrow. And what the Imam said, he mentions. And the Imam takes this body and keeps it with the others. This is Al-Yaqubi. At-Tabari goes on. He says he was killed in his father's lap, and Imam Hussein cleaned the body of blood. The killer being Hani bin Thubayt. Ibn Atham mentions the Imam comes to the tent, and then he asks for the baby, and then later on mentions the baby is struck on the neck. So it's developed over time. Now perhaps there are other factors that these later historians had access to different materials, who knows. But let's look at it a bit further. We go later on, Mufid passes away 413. We started around 200. Imam was sitting near the tent and the child was brought to him. Tusi, now it doesn't mention Ali Asghar, but mentions this walking. We were discussing yesterday the A'mal of Ziyarat Ashura. Tusi mentions after the Ziyarat, you walk and recite Inna Lillah wa Inna Ilayhi Rajiun once. Ibn Tawus mentions recite it 7 times. Coming back to this narrative of Ali al-Asghar, Al-Jurjani mentions, this is from that Abdullah was killed. We are coming to this instance that the Imam Hussein throws the blood into the air and it doesn't come back down. We go on. Al-Khawarizmi mentions. Now I'm not mentioning in detail what they're saying. I'm just mentioning certain points that were missing in the previous mentions. Where Imam Hussein says, is there any aida? هل من ذاب يذب عن حرم رسول الله؟ هل من موحد يخاف الله فينا؟ هل من مغيث يرجو الله في إغاثتنا؟ هل من معين يرجو ما عند الله في إعانتنا? Is there any supporter to help the haram of the Rasulullah, the family of the Rasul, of the Prophet? Is there anyone who can aid us? So Khawarizmi is now mentioning what Imam Hussein is saying, right? So we see over time This is 568. We started around 200. 200 years, we have a more comprehensive account of this story. Then we come to what's known as Maqtal Abu Mikhnaf, or the pseudo Maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf. Why do I say pseudo Maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf? We find this text coming in the 6th century. However, Abu Mikhnaf lived, who had passed away in 157, 2nd century, right? Tabari passes away 310, quotes Abu Mikhnaf. But this book comes later on, 6th century. Now, Muhaddith Nuri says that Abu Mikhnaf is reliable, his book is reliable. However, the current Maqtal Abu Mikhnaf that we have at hand isn't that original Maqtal Abu Mikhnaf. So there was a Maqtal Abu Mikhnaf, which Tabari takes from. However, apparently it got lost, and later on in history, in the 6th century, another Maqtal comes up with the same name, Abu Mikhnaf. Now, there are a bit of discrepancies in this Maqtal. For example, this Maqtal quotes Kulayni, which is surprising, because Abu Mikhnaf dies in 157, Kulayni dies in 329. So this person is quoting from someone who comes in the future. Anyway, let's take what Abu Mikhnaf mentions. That he mentions that this is Ali Asghar is my little son, Tifl Saghir, 6 months. Kulthum requested him, Imam, to take the baby and quench his thirst, who was thirsty for the last 3 days. Imam pleaded for water. They threw an arrow and it hit him from ear to ear. Right? So there's this development of this story. We go later on to, and I'm not quoting all the different variations in the development of this story. I'm just picking a few points. Akhund Mullah Al-Fadl Darbandi. Now, this is the same guy who, a few nights before we mentioned, he encouraged the practices of cutting, tatbir, etc. He mentions that Imam did istighatha. He goes and he cries out. Now he becomes very imaginative. He becomes poetic. Up till this point in time, there is a discussion on what Imam says and what happens. Now, Darbandi is now depicting how Ali Asghar responds. So he says the baby tore his swaddle blanket and threw himself from the cradle. Right? So this is how he is narrating it. I'm not saying right or wrong, this is how he is doing it. He mentions Imam's beard was dyed in blood, Kulthum was crying, even the Bani Umayyad soldiers started crying in mourning because Imam went and asked for water for this baby. And there are many later sources, for example, the 3-pronged arrow comes later on. So there are all these differences and development of these texts, perhaps for various reasons. Could be that some books were lost. We don't have access to these books, which may have been more in detail that these individuals later on had access to. Or there could have been errors. Or some of the earlier sources were summarizing the reports. Or some later on were expanding the report. Some of the narrations of the Maqatil were Zaydi, Sunnis, and different denominations. The Zaydis were very revolutionary. Perhaps they wanted to build this narrative of this revolutionary narrative. And there are many other reasons that could be inattention to the precise rendition, relying on faulty memory, or perhaps because history is not taken so seriously as fiqh is. In fiqh, you scrutinize everything. History, there's a bit of relaxation. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, in the 20th century, scholars realized that there's a lot being recited that is unverifiable. And even till today, you go to certain communities, there's stories based on dreams, there's stories based on, myths, etc. For example, I don't know if you've heard this, that in Nepal, there were individuals who were doing zanjir and they died, and then Hazrat Abbas came and gave them life, and they did zanjir again and they died, and so there are all these stories that are coming into the recitations, the remembrance of Imam Hussein. So the scholars, Muhaddith Nuri, for example, in Lu'lu al-Marjan say, today we must mourn Hussein, but there are tragedies which have befallen Hussein in our era which didn't occur in the past. And they're all the falsehoods that have been said in regard to the event of Karbala. So we have scholars that are questioning these exaggerations in the stories. Mutahari, for example, mentions that somebody narrated that Imam Ali was giving a sermon, and Hazrat Abbas was there, and Imam Hussein was there, and Imam Hussein asks, "I want water." And Hazrat Abbas brings water, and Imam Ali starts crying because of what's going to happen. Mutahari mentions the point where Imam Ali was giving sermons was when he was caliph. This was in Kufa. Imam Hussein would have to be around 33 years of age. Hazrat Abbas around 15 years of age. It's not befitting for a grown man to act in such a way, and neither would have this incident happened. Anyway, Mutahari mentions other points which he queries. Layla, right? We have this story that Layla, the mother of Ali Akbar, was there. Mutahari says there is no evidence of Layla being there. And there is this story that is mentioned that Layla calls out to Allah that please return my Ali Akbar, and if you do, I will plant basil from Makkah to Taft. Mutahari mentions Taft is the name of a place in the poetry of Layla and Majnun. We know the story of Layla and Majnun. So we see this sort of infiltrating the stories. We have him critiquing Mullah Wais Kashifi, the story of Zafar Jinn. I don't know if you've heard it, that Imam Hussein was going to the battlefield and a jinn comes to him. Imam says, "I'm going here." Zafar Jinn goes his way and then returns back to the battlefield and finds Imam Hussein is dead. And there's so many variations of these stories. Some say that Zafar Jinn passed away a few years ago, like from Imam Hussein's time till a few years ago. Mutahari critiques this and is very highly critical of this story. We know of many others, for example, like Qasim getting married. Again, Mutahari is very, very critical of this. One of this is Imam Hussein killing 300,000 people. If you kill 300,000 people, assuming you have the ability to kill 300,000 people, one person every second, that's 300,000 seconds, Mutahari says. That's 83.3 hours, right? And we know that from Dhuhr to Asr, the battle is finished around that time. Where does 83.3 hours come? These people who narrate say, the battle of Karbala was beyond 24 hours. Mutahari, highly critical of this, says this does not make sense and this should not be recited. Comes back down to the notion of crying. Why are we supposed to cry? What is it about crying? What is it supposed to bring about? Is it mere crying? And I know there may be narrations, and this isn't the place to critique, it's another talk in itself, that there are narrations exhorting crying. For example, man baka wa abka wa tabaka falahul jannah. Whoever cries, makes cry, or acts like crying, then for him is paradise. Now, prima facie, in face value, there are issues with this, because crying is a natural emotion, right? We naturally cry, and it's fine to have that natural emotion, but to fake cry is a bit problematic. So crying in and of itself, or recitation of narratives without exaggeration, with a sort of balance, is fine. With poetic license is fine. But however, this emphasis on crying for the sake of crying is a bit questionable. Mutahari mentions in his book on this misconceptions about Ashura, he says that there was a community in Iran, and they would, the person reciting, when the lights would go off, he would take out a bag and start throwing these stones on the people there. So a person goes up to him and after, when the lights come back on, "Why do you do this? You're throwing stones on people, and when the lights come back on, there's blood on these people and they're all crying." He said, "These people are not crying, so I have to take these stones and hit them. Because in crying of Imam Hussein, there is reward." So Mutahari is highlighting the extremes that people go for making others cry. which makes us question what is crying supposed to, on Imam Hussein, supposed to bring about. It's supposed to evoke emotion. It's beautiful at times to listen to a nice poem or poetry that makes you feel sad, which is fine. But crying in and of itself, crying for the sake of reward is, by exaggerating, is problematic. And crying should bring about something more within us. Should bring about some alignment with the message of Imam Hussein. The question I ask, do you think today that the mourning of Imam Hussein is reduced to mere tears and emotions? And then we'll open up the floor for questions. Okay, I'll open up the floor to any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from either the men's or the women's side?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for your talk and for your series of talks. Quite interesting. I think lots of food for thought there. What was particularly interesting for me tonight, especially, was your Slido poll. And I'm amazed to note that 90% of the audience here think that you're invited to evoke an emotional response. It doesn't sound like the audience that I know and love over the last 40 years. I was very surprised that 90% feel that way. So perhaps, maybe we ought to be looking at those polls and seeing, is there something intrinsically wrong with the way the question was answered or how it's understood? So if you look at, for example, the ones on Matam, Matam could be anything from somebody quietly beating their own chest in pain at the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam and connecting with him. Or it could be people who are beating their chest going down Hyde Park during a jalous. And, you're evoking a whole sense of emotion and a whole spectrum because of the way the question is asked. It's too narrow in its field, if you see what I mean. The question I wanted to ask you really was, in terms of your presentation regarding the one-liner from the early historical sources about Ali Asghar to the development of how that story happened, notwithstanding the exaggeration, obviously we would exclude all of that. But is that because of all of that being exaggerated, or is it because of the growth in the body of knowledge around the events through research and understanding that the story develops?
It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. But there could be a couple of factors. So one is maybe the early historians who narrate that story didn't have access to certain materials that later on historians did. That could be a factor. Or it could be a factor that people wanted to make others cry. So it's hard to tell exactly and pinpoint where the differences are stemming from. We can but speculate that there are a number of factors in this expansion of the texts.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from either side?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, brother, for your talk. Actually, there is a question here. Do you think that without this emotion and these developments, the revolution or uprising of Imam Hussein would be continuous until this time, and maybe it will be continuing, maybe 100 years later?
So I think, for example, in the 20th century, scholars such as Mutahari, Muhaddith Nouri, etc., saw a threat. And they saw the threat being that the message of Imam Hussein was being hijacked by people who are exaggerating the story and who are reducing Imam Hussein's story to mere crying and emotions. Ali Shariati mentions black Shiism versus red Shiism. One Shiism is about crying and being the oppressed, etc. And one Shiism is about being revolutionary and being upholding those principles of Imam Hussein. So emotions, very important. No one denies that. Mentioning the story of Imam Hussein, very important. No one denies that. But certain scholars saw it problematic that the story is being hijacked. So instead of focusing on just crying, right? I'm not saying do not cry. I'm saying on focusing just crying is problematic, but rather crying or narrating the story of Imam Hussein with an aim in the end, with these values that Imam Hussein was professing of justice, of standing up against injustice, also needs to be there. And yes, emotion is very, very powerful a tool for evoking the hearts of the people, and has been, will be. Yeah.
I was just wondering, can our scholars get together and talk about this?
So we've had the Shia Scholars Forum in Birmingham who've gathered and discussed this particular topic on the development of the Maqtal literature. And yes, there needs to be more discussion on it. I think many a scholar, many a reciter on the mimbar does not think about this development, and many a reciter is going with the flow, is an autopilot also. And there's also this lack of awareness of how relaxed history is taken without scrutiny amongst the reciters. There isn't this investigation, does this actually make sense? Or it just becomes a sort of the culture amongst the speakers to just make people cry. So yes, definitely scholars need to sit down together and discuss this openly and in an honest fashion.
Sheikh, thank you very much. In some countries like Iran, for example, the event of Ashura is only commemorated on 2 days. So it's Tasua and Ashura. It's not the 10 days. So where does the 10 days start? Is it an Asian tradition, or is it from Lebanon or whatever?
Yeah. So we find in the Buyid dynasty that only 1 day was the Ashura, and the shops were closed, as I mentioned the first. And then later on, we find this expanding. The justification for that is, I think Imam Reza mentions that when Muharram used to come, my father, Imam Kadhim, would become very sad, and he would, until the day of Ashura. So that's used as a justification. I don't know about the veracity of that, but then that's then expanded over time to become 10 days, and then 40 days, and then 40 plus, I don't know how many then. But it's, I don't know exactly pinpointing where it's coming from, but you can see the development over time that it's expanded also.
We've just got a question from online. If you don't mind. So how do you think the principle of tasamuh influenced the compilation of ahadith works? Is there any major opposition to it?
To tasamuh? So tasamuh is not in regard to compilation of hadith, it's in regard to taking these hadith and applying it in our life. So opposition to tasamuh, there are those who, so tasamuh results in an act being considered recommended. It's recommended to do X, Y, Z because we heard someone saying that the Prophet said so. Those who do not agree with tasamuh would say, you hope to get that reward. So that's perhaps the opposition. And yes, certain scholars like Sayyid Kamal Haidari say that a lot of superstition that has infiltrated into the Shia sort of corpus is because of this principle of leniency. It's destroyed paraphrasing his words, the Shia sort of outlook because of all these stories that are mentioned and stuff, without scrutiny.
Salam, thanks for the talk. I found it really good the way you presented the sort of one-line statement of supposed fact through to like the expansion of sort of story. But the dates around the early was it 150 to about 180, just over 200 after Hijrah, was that right? And then isn't that the time of like the 8th, 9th, 10th Imams? So couldn't we have some sort of more reliable sources from that period to help, expand on what we know from Karbala?
So we would, again, it's historians who are writing it. The earlier sources are not necessarily Shia sources. In fact, many of the earlier sources that we are quoting, these Maqtal literature, are Sunni sources. So these early historians are not Shia. So there's a lack of these Shia historians in the earlier sources. Later on, yes, Shia historians come and report this Maqtal literature, but perhaps snippets can be taken from the Imams in terms of narrations and stuff like that, but nothing as a whole literature talking about the incident of Karbala in detail. So there wasn't this present at that time, at least amongst the Shia circles, in such detail. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going there.
So if we were to transport ourselves onto the plains of Karbala, we see an individual, the brother of Hussein, Al-Abbas, and we hear a lot about his bravery. On the day of Ashura, he seems to be eager to go onto the battlefield, but Imam Hussein tells him to stay, according to some narrations. He finally is given permission, and he goes onto the battlefield. He fights bravely, according to some reports. He reaches the Furat. He cups some water in his hand, and he reminds himself of the thirst of Hussein. A poem attributed to Abbas says, يا نفس من بعد الحسين هوني ومن بعده إن كنت لا تكوني هذا حسين وارد المنون وتشربين البارد المعين. He says, "O my soul, you are thinking of drinking a cold cup of water, whilst Hussein is drinking from the cup of death." He takes this water and goes back. Reports mention, as he is going towards the camp, the enemy come from behind and cut his right hand. He shouts out, "Wallahi in qata'tumu yamini, inni uhami abadan an dini." That even if you are to cut my right hand off, I will still protect the religion. I will still protect that rightful Imam. They come and they cut his left hand. And he shouts out, "Ya nafs la takhshi min al-jabbari, wa abshiri bi rahmatil ghaffari." Oh my soul, don't be scared of these oppressors. I give you glad tidings of the All-Merciful. He is now in a dilemma. How does he go back? He has nothing to present back to the Imam. They attack him and he falls onto the ground. He calls out to his brother. Imam Hussein goes into the battlefield. He holds Abbas, his dear brother, in his hands. Tears flowing from his eyes. He cries out, according to some narrations, "Al-an inkasarat dhahri." Now my back is broken. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين.
Salawat.
Fatima, you have given all of your family for Allah. There is your son standing alone, calling for help to Allah. Where is the flag bearer of Islam to support him, Ya Allah? Where is Akbar to comfort him, the reminder of Rasulullah? Where is Asghar with such parched lips? He was so thirsty, Ya Allah. Fatima, you have given all of your family for Allah. There is your son standing alone, calling for help to Allah. Your backbone, Abbas, he loved his niece, little Ruqayyah, your daughter. He offered his arms and his right eye just to go and fetch a water. An empty mosque, a fallen flag, the moon of Hashemite slaughtered. Fatima, you have given all of your family for Allah. There is your son standing alone, calling for help to Allah. Hazrat Akbar, like the Prophet in his looks and soul, he tasted death, but to Allah was his ultimate goal. Standing for truth, his sacrifice, sweeter than honey, Allah. Fatima, you have given all of your family for Allah. There is your son standing alone, calling for help to Allah. Baby Asghar, he was so thirsty, but he still went and answered the call. On the desert plain, slain heartlessly, just 6 months, so small. Neither the sky nor the the sacred land would accept his blood. Ya Allah, Fatima, you have given all of your family for Allah. There is your son standing alone, calling for help to Allah. Soldier must carry Imam to the battlefield to fight, but he won't leave. Ruqayya is clinging to his legs so tight. She is pleading, Father, don't go. Just imagine Hussein's plight. Fatima, you have given all of your family for Allah. There is your son standing alone, calling for help to Allah. Fatima, you. Salawat.